Have you ever wondered how colonialism reshaped South Asian societies, particularly their views on gender and sexuality? In the colonial era, Western powers like the British brought with them a suitcase full of Victorian-era morals and Judeo-Christian beliefs. These new imports had a distinct flavour of heteronormativity, viewing anything outside of male-female relationships as deviant or immoral. Now, imagine the culture shock. South Asian societies, with their fluid and diverse understandings of gender and sexuality, suddenly found themselves facing a starkly different moral compass. Picture a mosaic of diverse expressions of love and identity, suddenly being judged through a monochrome lens. The colonial powers didn't just build railroads and administrative systems, they constructed an entirely different moral framework, one that was often at odds with the indigenous cultures they ruled over. As we see, colonial powers spread more than just their rule. They imposed an entirely different moral framework on South Asian societies. The colonial impact was not merely ideological, it had legal implications as well. With their arrival, colonial powers didn't just bring with them their moral compass, but also their legal codes. One of the most significant examples of this is Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, enacted in 1861. This law, steeped in Victorian-era morality, criminalised carnal intercourse against the order of nature. The language was deliberately vague, but in practice, it was often interpreted as a tool to criminalise same-sex relationships. This legal code, among others, was used to enforce Western norms of sexuality and gender, casting anything outside of its narrow definitions as deviant or immoral. Thus, behaviours and identities that had been part of the diverse tapestry of South Asian societies were suddenly labelled as crimes. Essentially, the legal system became a tool for enforcing Western conceptions of sexuality and gender, marginalising those who didn't conform. The colonial influence had lasting effects on the indigenous understandings and practices of South Asian societies. The imposition of colonial legal codes and moral values wasn't just about introducing new rules and regulations. It was a systematic process that suppressed or criminalized indigenous norms and practices. The more fluid and diverse understandings of gender and sexuality that once thrived were now under threat. This shift in societal norms was particularly harsh for indigenous LGBTQ identities. They were now faced with laws that deemed their natural inclinations as deviant or immoral, pushing them to the fringes of society. The rich tapestry of diverse sexual and gender identities that had once been part of the cultural landscape was being rapidly erased or marginalized. The adoption of westernized notions of sexual and gender norms became increasingly prevalent, leaving little room for indigenous practices to flourish. Colonialism thus significantly altered indigenous understandings of gender and sexuality in South Asia. But the story doesn't end with suppression. It also involves resistance and adaptation. As colonial laws tried to squeeze indigenous communities into rigid boxes, these communities found ways to resist and adapt. For instance, many LGBTQ individuals cleverly navigated the maze of colonial legal codes. They found loopholes, exploited ambiguities, and sometimes simply flew under the radar. Subverting these codes became a form of quiet rebellion, a way of asserting their identities in a world that sought to deny them. Beyond individual acts of resistance, there were also collective efforts. Groups sprang up, advocating for rights and recognition, pushing back against the oppressive colonial norms. These movements, though often met with resistance, played a crucial role in keeping the spirit of diversity alive. So while colonialism did bring about suppression, it also sparked resilience. It forced communities to adapt, to find new ways of being and expressing themselves. The legacy of colonialism in South Asia is a complex tapestry of suppression and resistance. In the end, the impact of colonialism on South Asian societies was profound and far-reaching. The colonial powers introduced their own moral and legal codes, bringing with them Victorian-era morality and Judeo-Christian beliefs. These Western conceptions of sexuality and gender clashed with the more fluid and diverse understandings present in many South Asian cultures. The introduction of colonial-era legal codes, such as Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, led to the criminalization of certain sexual behaviors and the stigmatization of LGBTQ individuals. The imposition of these codes and values suppressed or criminalized pre-existing cultural norms, leading to the marginalization of indigenous LGBTQ identities and practices. Yet, despite these impositions, indigenous communities found ways to resist and adapt. They navigated and subverted colonial legal codes and organized movements advocating for their rights and recognition. Understanding this historical context is crucial to comprehend the contemporary challenges faced by LGBTQ communities in South Asia today.